All right. Welcome, everyone. For those of us who are online, thank you for logging in. If it's okay, I'm just going to take the stage real quick. All right. I don't need two microphones now. Perfect. All right. Good evening, everyone, and thank you all for joining us on tonight's event. My name is Joe Malbert Narvaez. I use he and they pronouns, and I currently serve as a diversity and inclusion coordinator for the Natick Diversity and Action Center. And I'm really excited and honored to be part of this series and assisting as your facilitator tonight. Before we begin, I'd like to inform you all that this event is being recorded for those who are unable to attend. We would like to ask that all questions are saved for our question and answers section at the end of our presentation. And for those of us who are online, please use the Q&A feature on your Zoom to submit your questions. Before we begin, I would like to start by acknowledging that those of us at our Trafiata campus in Fairbanks are on the unceded traditional lands of the Lower Tanana Dene people. In Nome, we are in Inupiat, Yupik, and Siberian Yupik lands. We honor the continued fight for the rights of our First Peoples and stand with them in solidarity and in action. At UAF, we are growing into a socially just and caring institution of higher education. This ongoing speaker series, known as Shine a Light, promoting conversations on diversity, equity, and inclusion, is designed to encourage understanding, build empathy, and engage us all in thinking critically about our worldviews. This series is led by our Northwest campus, but like all great diversity efforts, there are many partnerships and collaborations. We would like to thank UAF's Department of Equity and Compliance and the UAF Undergraduate Interdisciplinary Studies for collaborating with us on this event. I would also like to thank the Northwest campus for partnering with the Natick Diversity and Action Center to bring this series into reality. We've hosted several excellent topics throughout the series, such as discussions on Black history in Alaska, women's history with a focus on Alaska Native women, LGBTQ+ rights. And you can find all these recordings on our website, that is nwc.uaf.edu under the courses tab. Tonight, we are incredibly fortunate to be able to host this series in a hybrid format for the first time. So I really appreciate your patience with us. And I can't think of a better speaker to kick us off. Our discussion tonight is titled The Queer Art of Holding Still, led by New York City-based artist, performer, and UAF August Semester faculty member, Jonathan Van Dyke. So Jonathan Van Dyke conceives of holding still as a generative, active state of being. Van Dyke draws upon his experiences creating and enacting durational performances, some of them lasting as long as 48 hours, along with his work being part of and advocating for marginalized communities, including many collaborations with queer identified performers worldwide. Encompassing video documentation, deep dives into art history, and a behind the scenes look at what it's like to stand and view a Jackson Pollock painting for 40 hours, Van Dyke helps us conceptualize how we can all benefit from long pauses. His research and practice takes on a special meaning in a year of complex transitions. And without further ado, please welcome Jonathan Van Dyke.
Hi, everyone. I'm really delighted to be here, and especially to start off this new school year. I want to thank those of you who are here in person, and also all of you folks who are watching online. We are going to use closed captioning in the recorded version of this, so because of our campus policies, I'll be keeping my mask on, but you'll be able to read the captions if necessary in the version online. So I also want to thank Joe, the Natick Diversity and Action Center, and John Smelter and undergraduate interdisciplinary programs for bringing me here as a visiting scholar. My presentation today is not so much a lecture, but more of an illustrated essay or a visual memoir. In my work as an artist and as an educator, I endeavor for resonance, for things that resonate. I define this as a way in which elements line up, almost like the transparent pages of an old anatomy book. It's a reverberation between my life experience, the things I'm making in the studio, and the world around me, which of course tonight includes all of you here listening to me. I imagine that this search for resonance, for reverberation, is also the creative and imaginative endeavor. Sorry, just getting used to the tech. Is also the creative and imaginative endeavor that moves us all in the effort, whether occasional or constant, to try and figure out why we are here in the first place and how we can, might, or should connect to one another. So as I attempt to externalize these resonances, I might skip from point to point, from place to place, and I hope that if I lose you, if I've already lost you, that I've also encouraged your own sort of daydreaming, and that you'll make your way back eventually to these words and images. And my presentation tonight is in 4 chapters. Joe, could you just move the cursor off of there? Okay. Chapter 1. For as long as I can remember, I've loved sitting or standing or lying still, staring into space. In 2008, I actively began pushing this notion to greater lengths, applying it to my artistic practice, and sometimes documenting it as a performance, a video in which very little happens. In the image you see here, the work entitled Everyone I Ever Loved, I stand and stare at a giant painting of a night sky by the artist Alex Katz. I'm thinking of everyone I ever loved for 60 minutes, but I'm only shown from behind, so that intentionally you as the audience can't see my face. I began asking artist friends to also enact these silent meditations, such as a group of artists standing in the woods at night, meditating and staring into the camera, or resting in a field of ferns as the sun went down. You can play the video on this one. I coaxed a group of teenagers at a performing arts high school to sit still in a classroom, staring at the camera. There were many takes, and this is one of the few where we weren't laughing at and with each other. You can play this video also, please. As I gained acuity in the practice of long stares, I sought out more resonance with sights and places and objects. In this video, I'm there in the middle, so you can barely see me, staring at the former country house of German art dealer Ferdinand Müller, where in this house, during World War II, he stored a collection of artworks labeled as degenerate by the Nazis. The camera is placed to be looking out from the house's windows as the sun sets. Now, the house is a celebrated architectural landmark designed by Hans Scharoun. There's the house. So how does one come into contact with a site at once picturesque, beautiful, and loaded with such difficult artistic and political history? I pushed the notion of long stairs to greater limits in a 2011 work entitled The Long Glance, held at the Albright Knox Art Gallery in Buffalo, New York, during which time I stood and silently stared at a large Jackson Pollock painting, Convergence, of 1951, for 40 hours, or one standard American work week, arriving at the museum before they opened, walking away after they closed, and kept to the rule that while performing, I would never turn my head away from the painting. Now, I had this idea of placing my queer body in relation to a major work made by an artist who seemed part of a club I could never join, a macho, cowboy-esque figure born of the American West, pictured here famously in Life magazine in paint-splattered dungarees with a cigarette dangling from his mouth. Now, Pollock's paintings are often referred to as action paintings, so that they themselves are identified with the act of doing. And I'll just note that in the background is the artist Lee Krasner. Pollock was Lee Krasner's husband, and really without Krasner, none of this work would have been possible. But at least in my performance, my quote unquote non-macho self would assert its presence not by action, not by doing, but through the sort of opposite of action, through holding still. The 40-hour work week, the duration of the performance, would serve as a reminder that the city of Buffalo, where this painting is housed, accrued wealth and power through the labor of its workers, many of them standing on the factory floor, and I wanted to parallel this pose. And it was this same wealth and power accrued through this factory labor and industrial might that made it possible for the museum in Buffalo, the Albright Knox, to purchase the painting at all. Pollock made convergence around the same time that Buffalo's population had reached its peak, declining thereafter, just as Pollock concurrently began a steady decline in his own mental and physical health. If these action paintings are sometimes mentioned, including by Pollock himself, as works with deep spiritual resonance, then I would take that idea, though somewhat ironically, at face value, meditating myself into the work, looking my labor. 20th century American artists fought for this very idea, that their artistic work was an extension of their own working class experience. And so they often used industrial materials, as seen here, preserved in Pollock's studio. These are enamel paints made for boats and outdoor surfaces. Now, embedded in this same macho stance, this working class stance, was, one might say, the fear among these artists that their abstract works might be thought of as frivolous and decorative. And Pollock was apparently embarrassed when his paintings were used as a backdrop for a Vogue magazine fashion shoot. But yet, let's not forget that homosexuality at the time was illegal. And in an exhaustive article in 1963 in the New York Times entitled "Growth of Overt Homosexuality Provoking Rising Concern," my now hometown paper discussed inverts, which was Freud's term for homosexuals, uniquely positioning us as if we're upside down. The article goes on to say in the top left there, inverts are most concentrated or most noticeable in the fields of the creative and performing arts and industries serving beauty and fashion needs. So you can imagine there was this sort of fear that was connected to this very media around what it meant to be gay at the time. But let me also admit that in terms of machismo, that notion is alive and well in the gay male community of which I'm a part. At the time that Pollock made his painting, one could order, quote, male physique journals, which most always featuring white men, and have them sent to P.O. boxes in unmarked envelopes. And I can guarantee you that these were not always being ordered by men working in beauty and fashion. But this same standard of desirability and machismo, of course, continues in the LGBTQ community today. And so in preparing for this performance, I had my own physical expectations to contend with. I trained for 6 months and worked with a dancer in order to stand semi-comfortably for 8 hours at a time. I raised my desk and work tables to standing height. I took an unpaid leave from my then job to perform the piece. And while I was an official performance of the museum and they paid for some of my expenses, I went into debt to stand still. Now, I realized many unforeseen effects from the performance, including a heightening of my peripheral vision and an increased sensitivity in my hearing and smell, so that I began to recognize which security guard was walking past me through the sound of their walk and the scent of their soap. And without my phone, keys, wallet, or anything else on me, after a couple of days, still with the painting in my sight, I found myself accessing memories that are usually buried under the constant distraction of screens. Now, my boyfriend at the time came to the Albright Knox for the last day of the performance. And after its conclusion, we embarked on a brief trip to Toronto. He had a long and complicated immigration story that brought him and his family to the US through Canada in an act of political asylum. And as we crossed the border, he was detained for questioning. I stood outside in the immigration office, of course, refusing a chair, and while standing, started to find myself fixating on a giant map of Canada, slipping out of time into a sort of meditative trance in which many minutes passed by like seconds, a sort of wonderfully strange sensation of staring at an object and sort of shifting into this trance-like state, which I could call upon for many weeks thereafter. Now, I knew my partner was in no real danger at this moment, and yet, for him, like so many, where the movement from one place to another is a matter of great urgency. Who was I to be in a trance at this moment? What was I doing? What was the point of being so committed to standing still? Chapter 2. When I was a child, my father, also an artist and educator, would often ask me to sit for a portrait. And it was said by my family that the young me was so frequently found in corners and margins, reading or thinking or staring into space, that my dad, enamored with the work of the artist George Siegel, made a full plaster version of me, a second Jonathan, forever holding still. As any sitter for a portrait knows, you are both there and not there, a muse and an object. And to maintain my silence and stare back at my father was a practice in reversing hierarchies, the child staring the parent down. It was a practice in feeling empowered by holding still. From a young age, I also came to love staring at old paintings, perhaps because I could identify with the figures holding still for the artist's gaze. Now, let's be clear, these paintings, mostly made by men, present a whitened fabrication of saints and martyrs wearing garments, like the Judith here in expensive furs, that could only really be afforded by the person who commissioned the painting itself. And yet I think of art museums as living places, as sites of contemplation in which we can argue with past notions, a place for walking, for thinking, for seeing. And I became especially enamored with Renaissance figures who tersely hold their suffering or show off their leaking bodies. And there are nearly naked saints and Christs who are enduring, holding, immobile, flirting with the erotics of wounding, holding still. But can we unfreeze these depictions and reimagine them as stances of vulnerability? Could we reimagine these modes of bodily endurance not as passivity? In this pandemic period in which so many human bodies are suffering, so many are lost, in which our climate is buckling under the weight of too much human activity, could we forefront other notions to do less, to use less, to take a day to feel sad, to rest, to renew, to opt out, to lie horizontal, to be immobile, to be a sissy? The psychiatrist Bessel van der Kolk has famously noted that the body keeps the score, that what our brain cannot process, our body holds on to, feels. And he notes in a 2013 interview that the nature about trauma is that you actually have no recollection for it as a story. The nature of traumatic experience is that the brain doesn't allow a story to be created. The brain doesn't allow a story to be created. And as much as I love figurative paintings, of course, I also love abstract painting too. And van der Kolk's words are also a description of why abstraction is such an apt medium for expressing what cannot be said. Abstraction then might externalize what cannot be explained in words. This might be an abstract painting like Pollock's, here showing a detail of convergence, the painting that I looked at, or maybe a work of one of my later heroes, like Sam Gilliam, who took the canvas off the stretcher, or queer artist Louise Fishman, who died just a few weeks ago. And as an aside, I'll note that I recently found this text from Fishman that applies to, I think, all that I'm saying here, where she says, "I've learned that a quick look can be very damaging. You often see very little of a painting in a quick look." Now, every trauma likely triggers the memory of associated traumas. I grew up in rural Pennsylvania, but I've lived in New York City for the last 20 years. And in the period in which New York City was at the epicenter of the pandemic in March 2020, when we could barely leave our houses, I was reminded of being picked up from kindergarten by my grim-looking parents. My elementary school was a few miles from the 3 Mile Island nuclear plant on the Susquehanna River in Pennsylvania. And it threatened us with a partial meltdown and release of radiation. And my parents packed what they could and got my brother and our dog and me out of town. This was no time for holding still. Now, my grandmother, whose backyard actually overlooked the nuclear power plant, she was that close to it, refused to evacuate. Speaking of radiation, if I can't see it, I won't be afraid of it. If I can't see it, I won't be afraid of it. A phrase that always touches me now, as a person who spent his life focused on exploring visual culture. Of course, we can't see a coronavirus or carbon emissions, but perhaps our collective work in pausing and taking even a moment to hold still is to imagine, to visualize what we aren't seeing or what we might see. Here, the painter, environmentalist, and AIDS activist Frank Moore made a work trying to visualize the chemical compounds of environmental poisons in the water supply. You see those wafting up on the top left of the painting. And then I also just put this in because it's one of my favorites, which is a hospital bed, which has been frozen over with ice and in which polar bears are searching for meat. Now, as we begin to figure out what to do in a pandemic, as we keep trying to figure that out, it wasn't a stretch for me and many of my peers to realize how the negotiation of physical contact is an area of hard-lived experience for so many queer people and gay men. We've learned to survive decades of the AIDS epidemic by preparing, thinking ahead, discussing, and opening up about our safety practices, our infection status, and ultimately by depending upon medicine, both treatment and prevention, now for many of us in the form of a daily preventative pill, so that these other body extensions, a condom, a mask, a pill, a vaccine, are already a matter of simply being able to survive. But let's be clear, effective prevention and treatment for HIV/AIDS was hard won by the tireless action of activists, many of them we've now lost. Groups like ACT UP protested in front of Trump Tower in 1989, furious that the Trump organization was receiving tax abatements while those with AIDS were losing their housing. And Ronald Reagan would not speak the word AIDS publicly until a press conference in 1985, 4 years after the virus was identified. This is well-known knowledge, but I think it bears repeating. AIDS activists staged die-ins on busy city streets, blocking traffic to make themselves visible. Isn't this an act of holding still, a non-violent pause, akin to more recent protests, such as those at Standing Rock, a name, Standing Rock, which beautifully connotes the durability and power of holding still? Chapter 3. I want to differentiate between holding still and holding back. I'm not arguing for the repression of the self or of one's emotions. But is it possible that queer bodies carry a special knowledge of holding still as a form of self-preservation? It's the use of a sort of cautiousness, a reserve, observing before acting. And I think this is a sort of technique or habit that members of all marginalized communities might adopt when they come into contact with the dominant and dominating. Now, I was an ebullient child, a flamboyant kid, bullied for talking too effusively, teased by the girls on the bus that I talked like they did, and threatened frequently by a guy named Earl in middle school because I decorated my clothes and painted my jeans with bleach. Perhaps your bully had a different name, and I can only imagine that Earl was acting out on whatever abuse was being enacted upon him. After all, we were both really just kids, just children. And yet I can barely remember the names of any other middle school peers except his. Even now, I unconsciously hesitate around the bigger and louder guys at the gym. Now, my middle school bus passed daily a rest stop, a highway rest stop, located at the edge of a woods. And in 1986, when I was just a kid, our local newspaper, the Harrisburg Patriot News, conducted a series of exposés revealing that this rest stop was a cruising ground for gay men. Now, much later, maybe 2010, I had an artist residency. That's when I worked with the teenagers who were holding still. I had an artist residency that took me past this same rest stop near my childhood home. And I kept remembering over and over what I thought was the first line of this article from the Patriot News, something salacious about men having sex on picnic tables. I was certain I had imagined this line, but I would repeat it to myself, sort of chuckle every time I drove by. But eventually I got sort of consumed with this idea, so I sought proof, and after much work, I tracked down the original article on microfiche, the title of which was "Homosexuals Romp in Family Rest Stop." And there in the second paragraph, lewd conduct at the stop poses a health hazard as men have sex at night on picnic tables where families sit for breakfast a few hours later. So you can imagine what sort of information this puts into the head of a child who's trying to figure out their sexual orientation. Now, not so long after the rest stop expose, the country also erupted in crises over arts funding, especially monies given to openly LGBTQ artists such as Robert Mapplethorpe, whose work was labeled indecent. Now, Senator Jesse Helms said on the Senate floor, no artist has a preemptive claim on the tax dollars of the American people to put forward such trash, referring to their artwork as such trash. Now, not long after Helms said this, Mapplethorpe himself died from AIDS-related complications at the age of 42. And Helms went on to famously carry around a copy of a Mapplethorpe photo that pictured a Black man's genitalia. Now, I've come back to these two events as I've wondered why I still carry some internalized notions about deviance or contend with an idea that artists shouldn't make money, that they don't belong. Although I must also admit that that sense of non-belonging, that challenge by Helms and company, also made me want to be an artist. But let's think this through. For example, what message do we send to trans children through legislation barring their treatment? legislation made by those who don't themselves have trans children. What will these kids be processing as adults? And so, yes, queer people might hold back, might hold still, because we are told we have to, because it's actually a matter of public policy. One holds back as a matter of self-preservation. But couldn't we also sort of flip that and think of that holding back, that self-preservation, as a certain type of resilience? Could we redefine holding still and use it as a form of strength? The opposite of holding still might be characterized as doing without thinking, of speaking for others, of not waiting, of more than anything, imposing one's will by force, as famously said by the former US president when he talked of grabbing women, noting, "I don't even have to wait. You can do anything." Couldn't we flip this script by imagining that those who speak the least have the most to tell us, or those most out of sight hold special knowledge of what to see, like our seniors and older adults and the disabled, or that those who were already here can guide us best, such as Indigenous communities? So I'm not arguing for repression. I'm advocating for a heightened stance of contemplation, for room to listen carefully. I'm arguing against, "I don't even wait." I'm arguing against, "You can do anything." I've read that Rachel Carson, mother of the modern environmental movement, became so fascinated by tidal pools as a young woman that she would wade in them at night with a flashlight, spending hours in observation of what she saw. She became so skilled at this form of quiet observation, in this holding still in order to better see, that she recorded the beginning of climate-related sea level rise as early as the 1960s. Just gonna get some water. In 2018, the Columbus Museum in Georgia asked me to create a performance working with their collection. And I asked the museum to reorient itself around a group of quilts made primarily by anonymous women a century or more ago, most of which had never been on public view, objects that were waiting in the dark. I asked the community to join me as I stood silently and then looked at these quilts for 48 hours. You can play the video. So this is 2 minutes of the footage from that performance. So these artworks, sometimes called craft, were made slowly, pieced, stitched, made by those who, because of their gender, had no access to the art academy, no acknowledgement that their work was art at all. This postage stamp quilt was apparently started in the 1850s by a teenager recovering from typhoid fever, and it contains some 10,000 pieces. Now, according to family legend, they found a group of these quilts made in the 19th century in an attic of a house of a relative that had passed. And as they were moving out, they found the stack of quilts and they were going to put them in a bonfire, but they saved them at the last minute, donated them to the museum. But most of them had been in the museum, that had been in the museum's collection, had never actually been shown in public. And so as part of the performance, I also felt it was important to acknowledge the labor that is done to notice, to save, and to preserve these objects. And while I was working at the museum, they also brought into their collection this fragment of a textile made by enslaved people in the 19th century South, which is really an incredible object, particularly if you think about how this was made in the mid-19th century and compare it to works like Bridget Riley's geometric abstract paintings made over a century later. Again, thinking through what we see and what we don't see. So as we are reminded in these pandemic years, waiting and stillness are also the state of the unwell and of those who care for them, of those, the state of those who are out of sight. Recovery is work, a process. Now, both of my parents suffered through chronic critical illnesses. And from a young age, I was also surrounded by those for whom holding still and waiting for the next diagnosis, blood test, lab result was a matter of enduring. I spent long periods with my father in hospitals, sitting next to him in the dark, saying nothing, and found in those moments in which doing very little was enough, was everything, I found not pleasure exactly, but presence, the pleasure of being present. If you pulled back, if you saw these two family members on film, sharing a darkened clinic with the sound of machines humming, one in a bed, one on a chair, you might think they aren't doing anything, but actually one was beneath the skin getting better, and the other was witnessing that act. So while the body is holding still, how might the mind be making? Now in 2017, I had a bad accident in which I broke both of my wrists. And I have to say, for the first few months, I was strangely at ease. And I had the pleasure of having a whole community around me to feed me and help me get around. I was especially at ease too when there were visible signs, casts and braces of wounding. It was almost as if all those paintings I had looked at had somehow prepared me for this period of recovery, of being wounded. And interestingly, once those visible external signifiers were removed, the recovery that was not visible was much more difficult. Now, that same year, I began thinking about a new video, a new long performance, a long act of stillness, in which I would stand from dusk to dawn during some of the longest days of the year, staring at my parents' house in suburban Pennsylvania, holding vigil, a guard, but also a sort of suburban peeping Tom, an outcast to the nuclear family. The camera would be placed in the position of the waiting parent, looking out the window as if for someone to come home, as if inspecting the shadows. But I didn't really think I could do this performance at the time. It was too personally fraught, and its politics seemed too localized to myself. It didn't resonate. But then in 2020, with my father recently passed, and in the holding still of the pandemic, in the full bursting forth of the Black Lives Matter movement, in the more public recognition of the history of sustained violence underlining American history and wealth, and in a summer in which more fireworks were purchased than at any time in recent history, I thought to enact this performance on July 4th with the militaristic pops of firecrackers as a soundtrack. On that date, I could perform standing and staring witness from dusk to dawn as an action both personal and political, holding still in the dark amidst frenetic suburban noise, waiting for the eventual silence of the humans, passed out, asleep, dreaming, getting worse, getting better, and finally an orchestra of birds at pre-dawn, growing louder, tuning up the sun. And I'll just play a couple minutes excerpt from that video, which is about 7 hours long. So we won't play the whole thing. Okay. So that video is usually played like on through a projector. It's projected continuously. So maybe you come in if it's in a gallery and you see it for a few minutes. I'm still getting used to this in-person hybrid format with all these different devices. So that went a little faster than I thought it would. I think I was talking quickly because I was nervous. But we have some time for, I'd love to take questions from the audience here. And also, please, those of you who are watching on Zoom, I covered a lot of territory. So I'd really love some questions from all of you too.
Great. Thank you, Jonathan. We do have some questions online. So the first question that we have is in regards to your chapter 1. Do you see that people raised in certain societies or who represent certain demographics seem to be more comfortable with holding still, being quiet, and or accepting these activities?
Some people raised in certain societies or communities are maybe more comfortable holding still. I mean, I would say first and foremost, I'm like putting forward this idea that part of holding still is giving other people room to sort of speak for themselves. I think, you know, part of the, whatever you want to call it, toxicity, you know, sort of civil unrest in our society has been generated around like speaking for others, as I think was clear in the quotes I had from the former president. So I would say I don't want to speak for other communities in terms of like what it means to stand still or which communities have a comfort level of that. But I do think what I'm saying is that one's relationship to holding still is intersects with one's, of course, class, race, ethnicity, where you grew up, what you were told by the culture that you grew up within. And so it's, and I also want to make really clear that it's not only familial cues, but it's social and societal cues and also matters of law. I mean, particularly if you're being legislated to in a way that your actions are illegal. So of course, a queer person in a country, you know, like Iran comes to mind as being in the news a lot, where gay activity is punishable by, you know, extreme punishment or even death. Of course, you're going to have to develop some sort of coping strategies that might mean like being really watchful, being really vigilant, being hyper vigilant. which are also, by the way, signs of post-traumatic stress. So I think that's a great question. It's a really hard question to unpack, but I'd love to, get together a group of people with really different views and orientations who could unpack that together.
Thank you. For those of us who are in person, if you have a question, please feel free to raise your hand. I'll come walk to you with the microphone just so that the folks online can hear you. All right, our next question for Jonathan. It's in regards to your chapter 4. Did you feel that your injuries gave you permission to be still?
Gave me permission to be still? Yeah, I mean, nothing gives you permission to be still like having to be still, right? And being told, by a doctor that you have to. But interestingly, breaking both of my wrists, I could still walk around. I had to be really careful how I negotiated the world, because the worst thing that could happen would be that I would fall again, or one of the worst things that could happen. And I couldn't catch myself with either arm. So there was a sort of being a person who I think moves very quickly from thing to thing in general, as much as I'm an advocate for holding still. There was a sort of pleasure in being forced to slow down in that way. I'll also say, it's interesting though, I think we have this notion that, how can I say this? I think people who are recovering from an illness or many other things, or those in the disabled community, like I think we shouldn't give the impression that like someone is doing nothing, that they're like over there and we can forget about them, right? So like even for me, I felt much better physically and I recovered more quickly because I was like sort of walking around more and like trying to take the steps to be active. So I think we should like maybe expand and stretch our notions of what it means to be still, like what a range of activity could even be, and not to discount like the activities of someone who moves differently or has different abilities, and sort of like stretch out what we can learn from sort of all sorts of ability, as opposed to just having one point of view, which is like a binary about like being active or not being active. I think there's like such a huge range in there.
Oh, thank you so much. All right, I can bring the microphone to you. 1 second.
Thanks, Jonathan, for coming today and speaking to us. I thought it was a really interesting presentation. I was wondering about memory, and during your performances, was there any heightened, you talked about some of your other senses. Do you remember more from that time, this most recent piece? Do you remember your thoughts? Do you remember things that happened that night? Kind of just interested in the impact, and also some of your performances that were further back with adjacent things that were happening in your life. Was that time, did it, like the internal part of your life, how was it affected by these performances?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, these performances, of course, are like really long meditations. So as with any meditation, at the beginning, you're like really just coming to terms with all the stuff that's going through your head. So like doing the Pollock piece, like, the whole first, second day is like, is this, what is this all working? Did I pay my credit card bill? Like, it's like, just like all that stuff is flowing through your head, all that anxiety. And then it's like slowly that sort of gets emptied out. But you sort of need that structure to really access a lot of memory. So because the Pollock piece was so structured and I had prepared for so long, by the third day, even though I was still looking at the painting, I really started to feel myself like accessing things I hadn't remembered for a really long time. But I think that structure, that regularity of that meditation every day sort of made that possible, and also becomes a sort of necessity, like people even who I've listened to interviews with people who were in solitary confinement, which like we should all be advocating against because it's a terrible torture. Speak about their their own survival tactic is like if you're going to survive that, you have to access your imagination. So you have to sort of take memory and then sort of imagine from it and like come up with all sorts of like fantasy scenarios in your head so that you're sort of living another life while you're in that state. So of course I wasn't having that experience in any way, but I do think that anyone who's in a situation in which they have this sort of repetitive structure of sameness, doing the same thing with very little else happening for that many hours a day, you sort of start to sink more deeply into your memories and into your imagination. My imagination also got super activated. So I'm saying that about the Pollock because like this piece was complicated. It was also a negotiation with my mom in a way. She was home. She was like looking at the windows throughout the night, like, is he okay? I knew that would be like a sort of tension between us, and that it would be also like a good sort of conversation, like a sort of silent dialogue for her and I to have. So I was a little more fixated like on the mechanics of it. And that happened in other performances as well. Like with the quilt piece, I was looking at 16 quilts for 3 hours a piece. So there was a lot of changeover. So I could, within that 3 hours, I could really sort of get into a place of like heightened imagination and memory. But that's like 3 hours is very different from 8 hours, for example. So it's just a real range. And then, yeah, the final thing I would say about that is just like the, I do 1 hour sustained observation practices. I'm doing one at the Museum of the North here on September 2nd. And I think what people generally find is when they do an hour sustained observation with a work of art, like within whatever your threshold is that you typically check your phone, like you're gonna just automatically after 7 minutes or whatever, like reach for your phone to want to look at your messages. Like it's just, we've changed our neural pathways so that we're programmed to do that. So there's this sort of beginning point in which you're like really wanting to be distracted, like your brain is like hungry for distraction. You have to push past that. Then you buy yourself a little bit more time. And then after about, I would say 30 minutes of that experience, people get really bored. And they're like, oh my God, this is gonna go on forever. I can't do this. This is too much. And then if you can pass through boredom, if you can like get through the valley of boredom, on the other side, there's these like beautiful rewards, because then your brain is like, has to go deeper, look more closely at whatever you're looking at, like access memory and access your imagination and start like sort of, popping and coming up with all sorts of new stuff. So that's the sort of getting through that is like, I think almost everyone has that sort of dip. I'm trying to do that type of meditation, at least in the US as I've done them.
Do you, this is a general question, not about anything, in your like intentional performances of like public displays of standing still, do you feel like those are in some ways like acts of defiance within the society that we live in?
Yes and no. I mean, it's a really different act of defiance to like go into a museum and say you won't leave from a painting than it is to like block a road or lay down on a street as a protest, right? So, but I do think like these are also works of art, so they're metaphors. They're like metaphors for how you could engage in any given situation differently, whether that's like the space of the family, whether it's the space of the museum. So if they're acts, I don't know if, in like working with the Columbus Museum in Georgia, for example, we worked together a really long time. So they gave me like access to their collection. I did multiple visits where I was like in their collection storage for days at a time. So I wouldn't call that an act of defiance, because it was more like an act of pragmatism, of like generative, pragmatic, sort of like challenging of one another. Like me going to the museum and saying, okay, can I take this out of the collection? Can I put this in your atrium? And they're like, no, you can't put it in the atrium. We get too much sunlight there. Then we're talking about it like, okay, well, maybe we could put them up for 3 hours. That might be okay. Can we build the structure in the atrium? Can we get all these volunteers to do this? Can we build this, display pulley and this like stage for the quilts? Can we teach other people to handle them? So those are not like acts of defiance, but they're definitely really generative. And by the end of that performance, like everybody in the museum was involved. The security guards are involved. The volunteer group is involved. The local art students were involved. And I think that that's like I hope was like a way of sort of temporarily restructuring the museum, restructuring it around women's labor, so that literally the labor of anonymous women was at the center of the collection. The atrium was right in the center of the building. And also taking an object which would have been defined as craft and putting it within this sort of center area of art viewing. Because museums, of course, like we think of museums, I think, as, I'm getting a little tangential here, but I'll come back to the point. We think of museums, I think, as these sort of like steady, like mausoleums, these like holding grounds for all these objects. But museums also are constantly figuring out why they have what in their collection and what they don't have and what they need. The Columbus Museum was unique in that they collected regional history and art. And so the only reason those quilts came into the collection in the early 20th century was that they were regional history. Because at the time, an art museum wouldn't have thought of them as art. So I'm sort of saying, okay, amazing, they're in your collection now. And of course, the curators are also saying, yeah, we think of them as art too. We have very different notions of what should be in or out of the collection. That develops this really generative conversation about like how to place an object like that in a new way. And in a sense, the museum has to defy its own history, right? And so it needs a sort of, I think, a sort of nudge from within in order to do something like that. And by the way, I hope that the Museum of Modern Art will eventually show some 19th century quilts in their collection, but I don't think they do.
Thank you. All right, the next question that we have for you is, how do you bring your holding still concepts to your non-performance work?
Mm-hmm. That's a great question. Well, it's not always easy. It's not always easy. I think you just make room for it. You make room for, I mean, wait, let me back up for a second. I mean, let's just say that the pandemic really sort of reordered things for all of us, right? So like many of us were in a holding pattern in terms of work or lost work. Many others had more work or were in really dangerous situations at work. The pandemic, of course, sort of reordered or like enforced a pause on all of us. So that was really interesting, I think, for me, because I had done all this sort of long pausing. I definitely try and include it through, I think you can do it in different ways. So, of course, the meditation practice, physical practices, stretching, everyday yoga, these are sort of like moving meditations or slow sort of quiet meditations. I sort of force myself to take a diet from social media, to not look at the news too much, to turn the radio off, which was really hard during the former presidential administration, but like it's been really challenging myself to not have to be connected every single minute of the day. We can't possibly do that. And I think that the purpose of finding space within one's everyday life for these pauses is so when you do have to take action, as I said, and I think it was in chapter 2, like using the pause to sort of imagine what could come or imagine different ways of being, so that when you do have to take action quickly, I think you have a sort of more of a mental preparedness in your head for different possibilities. And also that should make you take action, right? If we all really pause and think about like how the climate crisis is going to unfold very quickly, if we really like think through what that looks like, what that will feel like, if we pause and imagine that and we meditate on that, that should push us all to sort of take action differently and to sort of think through like what would the best action actually be, as opposed to the way that we work in this country, which is to only treat the symptoms of the problem as opposed to provide any prevention for the problem. So I think all of those like sort of contemplating gives one an opportunity to then act. Of course, you know, we could err on the side of like over contemplation, and in my own studio sometimes I have to sort of like push myself to like make decisions, right? Because I can also get too stuck in like cycles of contemplation and too many options. So I'm not advocating for that either, but I am advocating for everyone to like unplug, find a sort of daily practice, a walk or a stretch or a meditation or a sitting still and breathing or lying still and breathing, whatever you're able to do, that can sort of be incorporated and used as a time of reflection and also imagining.
Awesome, thank you. We have a few more questions, if that's okay.
Sure.
So we have one, it's both a comment and a question. So this is by Maureen Hogan. We have queer stillness could be caution, waiting to see if we belong, or also paralysis from trauma. But a reimagining could be like the body stillness within movement, like we find in yoga, or the sacred pause that some Buddhists talk about within conversation. Just a few thoughts. And then their question is, when you were doing the long performances, did you feel like you were meditating or in an alternative state of consciousness?
Oh, that's a juicy question. You know, the thing about maybe yes, a little bit an alternative state of consciousness. I mean, the thing about the quilts is that they're patterned. And so you're sort of following the pattern and you sort of get involved with this pattern. Pollock, of course, also like I'm super involved with what I'm looking at. And I'm gonna, I don't know a lot about this, but from what I understand, like some Tibetan monks look at like mandala paintings as a sort of form of long visual meditation or visualizing, so that the thing you're looking at becomes an aid to sort of entering a different state of consciousness or meditation. And I would say the interesting thing about both the Pollock painting and some quilts, but not others, and it really surprised me which quilts this happened with or not, is, you know, Pollock painting is called an all-over composition, meaning the composition spills off the edge of the frame and looks as if it could go on forever, like a rapidly expanding universe. Some quilts have borders in them, and some do not. So this quilt doesn't really have a border sewn on the edge. Now that could have become worn down and cut off, like it's hard to know. So for example, this textile is frayed. We don't know what else was there. But what's really interesting about looking at something that doesn't have a border is that you sort of stretch your mind into like what's happening beyond it. Whereas I noticed with quilts that had a sort of hard stop on one side, like a really particular border, I found them harder to look at for a long period of time. So I found that anything that had this sort of sense of endlessness really like took me way out there, and I really enjoyed that. And then I would say just getting really active with this sort of practice. Like I said about looking at that map of Canada, you can sort of flip into this almost like trance-like state pretty quickly, which maybe isn't something you always want to be doing. Like I wouldn't want to be doing that while I was driving, for example.
Thank you. One of the questions that we have online is, what do you, or what advice do you have for those of us who want to incorporate standing still in our daily lives?
Say that again, Joe?
What advice would you give those who would like to incorporate standing still or holding still in their daily lives?
Hmm. Hmm. I mean, I would actually tell people to go and sit and look at something for an hour. Like you could do that in nature, you could do that at a museum, you could really do that at any different kind of museum. If you're going to do it at a museum, it's really useful to pick an object that has some history to it, that has sort of complex use of materials, maybe something that's a little bit bigger than your own body. And when I say history, like older objects that have wear are really fascinating to work with, because you start to like look at the stains on them and see the marks of use, and how these objects were incorporated into everyday life or ritual practice. And so, yeah, go to a museum and like put your phone on airplane mode, set a timer for 60 minutes, make a commitment not to use your phone for that 60 minutes, and just observe and be with that object, and like get bored and don't take any notes. And then when the timer goes off, then take some notes, take a walk, maybe do it with a friend and ask each other how it worked. You could also do this in nature, which would be if you had a spot where you felt safe and warm. Of course, you could sit and try and stay maybe within like a 10-foot radius or something, and just look at what's around you. And maybe it's even just like a backyard that has a line of trees in it. And I promise that if you do that for an hour, you'll start to notice like aspects of those trees and the leaves and the way they move and the elements that you've never noticed before. So you could do that, for an hour. You could also do it like in a city, in an urban environment, staring out the window of a busy cafe, particularly if you were in a place where, the staff was okay with you sitting there and you weren't going to bother anyone, but you could just sort of watch things go by for an hour and see what happens. It could be 30 minutes too. But I think like making a sort of intentional pause can be really useful, and then seeing how that can then be useful in other parts of your life, in terms of decision making, in terms of like having a conversation where you just take a beat before you respond, which isn't easy for me to do.
Awesome. Thank you so much. When I think of standing still, and I think that one of the questions that one of our audience members asked here today, I think of like how hard it would be for me right now to stand still, and how growing up, like what I was taught is like standing still means sinking, and that we need to keep going. And I think of standing still as, even in our form, I think of an act of resistance, as like resisting everything that we've been taught, and paying attention to the things that sometimes we take for granted. So I just really want to thank you for presenting it's really hard for us to know like exactly what the artists like mean by their work, but it's what I think that's the beauty of your work, is really what it means to all of us could be different. So I want to thank you for that.
Thank you so much, Joe.
Yeah. All right. That's the last question that I can see. Oh, there was just one more that popped up.
Sure.
And I'll read this. Thank you so much for speaking with us tonight. You talk beautifully tied together so many facets of your work and practice with tangible comparisons that are accessible and informative. While you discussed some of your meditative projects, what did you incorporate into your everyday or a routine in preparation mentally for these performances? And as someone who's had the honor of previously participating in one of your sustained observation workshops, I recommend it to anyone who is able and available to participate. This is an anonymous attendee.
Thank you.
Yeah, but I'll repeat the question. well, you discussed some of your meditative projects. What do you incorporate into your everyday
Mm.
or a routine in preparation mentally for these performances?
It depends on the piece, because I like to do a lot of them standing, and I probably won't be able to do that, when I'm much older. But I make a habit of like standing at my desk for part of the day, not always being sitting down, physical practices, preparing for it. Let me think here. I have to say that like for that first big one, the Pollock performance, I was really consumed with the physical preparation of, I like had this idea that I was going to be like a statue. And when I'm performing, I want to make it clear, I'm not like frozen, like a performer you might see like on a city street who's like pretending to be a statue. I'm like gently moving the whole time and getting close up and getting far away. But for that piece, I was super consumed with preparing physically, but I didn't really prepare at all mentally. Like that was 10 years ago. I didn't have a particularly good meditation practice. I hadn't taken any classes. So it was really, really hard mentally, especially by like the fourth and fifth day. For the quilt performance, I did a little less physical preparation, and it was a little harder for me physically. And I did a lot more like mental preparation. And that was super useful, a lot of meditating, different practices. And what was I going to say? I also worked with Alexander technique. So I worked with dancers who used Alexander technique. These are like really useful practices just for like understanding your body. They're not exercise. They're really just like body awareness practices. Feldenkrais is another one. Bessel van der Kolk in The Body Keeps the Score talks about like Rolfing and like massage, and how in his work with veterans communities who suffer from PTSD, that yoga practices and massage can actually sort of help release traumatic memories that they can't release in any other way. So I'll also say the quilt performance happened not long after I had broken both of my wrists. So I was really like I was still like very much in like a state of trying to get better. And I think we forget like when someone has an accident or is grieving, like this recovery period takes a really long time. Like there's the visible period where someone like needs support and we give them support, hopefully. But then, like recovering from an accident like that took like a year and a half. It's just that you didn't see a lot of it. And I looked fine after, 7 or 8 months. But that internal and like even smaller physical stuff takes a really long time. So I think part of making room for this sort of stillness is also making room for like recoveries and wellness that have a much longer tail, as opposed to like a sort of fast, like get over it, move on type of recovery that I think a lot of us in this country grow up with. Thanks.
All right. Well, thank you, Jonathan, so much for sharing your experiences and your art with us. And for all of us who are here present and also virtually, thank you for joining us this evening. Please keep an eye out for upcoming topics throughout the Shine a Light Speaker Series. You can follow us on our website, nwc.uaf.edu. You can also follow the Northwest Campus on Facebook or the United Diversity and Action Center on Facebook, just so that you can see what we have upcoming. If you'd like to share the recording or give feedback, you can do so by visiting the courses tab at the website that I shared earlier, nwc.uaf.edu. Thank you, everybody, and have a great night. We're going to stop the recording and finish our webinar. Thank you so much, Jonathan.